I'd like to invite up on the stage here Tamara Braun, she's the Chief Customer Office for SAP Procurement Solutions Intelligent Spend, and herself also an ex-CPO at SAP, and also a Karthik Ramanna. Karthik is Professor of Business and Policy at the University of Oxford's Blatanovic School of Government. Tamara and Karthik, please take the seat.
I could start and jump immediately on that what Julia said. Green Ledger, carbon emission, Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtenschutzgesetz, and all these things.
I was so close.
But let us take a minute really looking at you as a person. You are super highly appreciated, as Julia as well said, from the decision makers, from the policy makers, and you are a great advisor for these policy makers, and it's not a secret that with your expertise you gave a lot of advice to the G20 in Indonesia last year, and not that you now share secrets with us, but can you tell us a little bit, when you are working in such teams, in such rounds, what is the focus of you? How can you help them? How can you advise them? So, as I said, not disclosing secrets.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I have a long and fond association with SAP on many dimensions, not least your chief learning officer is a former student of mine from 15 or 20 years ago, Max Wessel. So delighted to be here. Yes, I've had the opportunity to engage with a number of leaders now over the course of my academic career, particularly public sector leaders. And I'd say if I were to reflect on what is most concerning them, or that takes up most of their bandwidth now, is how to create the trust that's needed to make long-term decisions, particularly the kinds of decisions that require near-term sacrifices. We're living in a world where trust in public institutions is the lowest it's been since we've had reliable data, but certainly probably since World War II. And we're also living in a world where we've got to make a lot of big, important decisions around globalization, decisions around artificial intelligence and how we respond to that, decisions around mass migration, and decisions around climate change. And all of these decisions require making some near-term sacrifices in order to be able to make the kind of capital investments and human investments that are needed to be successful. And to do that in an era of low trust is especially challenging. So that seems to be the predominant concern.
And thanks a lot for sharing this with us so openly. And you touched already one topic, which is at the moment, I would say, this topic driving everyone. This is really the Gen AI. So really how to use it, how to embed it, how to bring it into the systems. From your point of view, Karthik, how can this influence sustainability? How can sustainability benefit out from that? And how do we bring it to the procurement leaders so that they can make use of it?
That's right. So artificial intelligence, like many transformative technologies, offers the potential for a tremendous reimagination of human society in a way that industrialization offered about 200 years ago. But just as with the story of industrialization, we saw that play out differently in different jurisdictions, in part because the institutions that govern the way industrialization would be deployed was very different across different countries. So we could get this very, very right, or we could get this very, very wrong. And so it offers tremendous potential. It gives you great cause for optimism. There's a lot of perhaps panic or concern about how this might sort of replace jobs and so forth. Artificial intelligence, as it's conceived at its basic level, knows more than it understands, which is very different from human beings, which understand more than they know. And that's a very big difference between the way we conceive artificial intelligence and the way we conceive human intelligence. So that gives me actually cause for reassurance and optimism, but also we can't sort of therefore, ignore the governance challenges that this presents. We have to get those rules of the game right. And history suggests these early years are enormously influential in setting the course of how this will evolve because of the sort of tremendous path dependency associated with this kind of governance of technology.
Yeah, that's really a great view, and especially when we look to this ESG, so where we say, hey, how do we measure it? And I know that you are as well in a debate between disclosure and accounting, so virtual things which go hand in hand with ESG are really always more the disclosure. What we are all striving for this green ledger is going definitely in the direction of accounting more. So how can we build the bridge? How can we incorporate Gen AI? How can we go really away from disclosure, or how can we keep the disclosure but bring it as well into accounting? So that is super interesting. What is your view on that?
Yeah. So I'm actually a relative newcomer to the space of carbon accounting. If you'd asked me 3 years ago whether I was working in this space, I would have said no. But about 2 years ago, I was invited to serve as a conference, at a conference discussant on carbon accounting. And that was actually the first time I read the GHG Protocol Scope 3 standard. And speaking candidly, I was astonished that that's what we considered the state of the art in accounting. About 15 years ago, I used to teach the core accounting class at Harvard Business School in the MBA program. And on the very first day of the program, we would say two things to the students. That every accounting system needs to count everything that's material, number one. And number two, it should count it only once. I have never encountered anyone that has pushed back against these two principles. And yet both of these principles are violated in the way we currently approach carbon accounting. Partly that's because it's not accounting. It's just a sort of a system of disclosure that has evolved, bottom up from what was a really passionate and sort of well-meaning environmental movement. I mean, to credit to the people who produced these standards 20 years ago or 15 years ago, nobody was talking about it then. And so, this has sort of emerged as sort of a patchwork solution. But in the last 5 years, both the urgency of climate change has become very mainstream, and more, governance systems are relying on these measures. The challenge with these measures, as Julia mentioned earlier, is that it would be like the Securities and Exchange Commission or the IASB saying, oh, if you don't know your gross margins, you don't know your cost of goods sold, no problem. Just find some industry average and use that. That's totally fine, right? I mean, we couldn't run a business. We couldn't run an economy like that. The stock market would crash because there was just no information. In fact, that's kind of what the world we lived in the 1920s, and we led to the stock market crash in 1929. So if we're really serious about addressing climate change, then at the heart of it is good carbon accounting. And that's what we've been sort of focused on in the last couple of years now, how to build that system. Yeah.
Yeah, really cool. And you mentioned it 2 years ago, you visited this conference. And is it by purpose or accidentally that 2 years ago you co-published with Bob Kaplan this famous article, Accounting for Climate Change, and you got awarded for this as well? Was it coincidentally, or what drove you and Bob to publish this at this time?
Right. So at the conference, this was in the time of COVID, so it was a virtual conference on Zoom. And in those days, you didn't even know who was in the audience because everybody sort of turned their camera off. I don't know, And but it turned out that when I was making my comments at the conference, in the audience was Bob Kaplan, who's previously been involved in developing activity-based costing and the balanced scorecard. Bob is a longstanding friend and mentor of mine. And he sent me an email after the conference saying, Karthik, I couldn't agree more with what you said. We should work on this together. And I almost ignored that email because I was working on many other things. Then he said something in there which really caught my eye. He said, and this might be the most important thing I ever work on. And given that he's worked on some really important things, I said, well, maybe we should pay some attention to this. So, I mean, the crux of my discussion was that if we're really interested in solving the problem of supply chain carbon accounting, for instance, you think this iPhone has thousands of components that are sourced across dozens, if not hundreds of layers of supply chain. And yet Apple seems to know down to the microcent what is the cost of this iPhone. And not just this iPhone, but that separate iPhone over there, which will have a different cost because we've made it a different batch, and Apple will know that as well. So how is it that Apple can figure that out? Well, it's basically the beauty of cost accounting and inventory accounting. And that technology has been around for hundreds of years. So in the same way that you can calculate the cost of this iPhone, you should be able to estimate what is the total embedded cradle-to-gate emissions of this iPhone. So that's the core of the e-liability idea. It leverages insights from cost and inventory accounting and applies it in the context of emissions measurement. And this technology, of course, can be used for other things like, I don't know, child labor and supply chains and so forth, but we can talk about that later. But that was the genesis of it. We put together a first draft of the article and we sent it to our friend Adi Ignatius, who's the editor-in-chief of Harvard Business Review. Shortly thereafter, about a week after it was published, we heard from the head of one of the world's largest capital market regulators. And he called us and he said, guys, this is a great idea. Who's doing this? And we said, well, as far as we know, nobody's doing this. And he said, well, that's a problem. I can't build regulation around something no one's ever done before. So why don't you get a few people to try it out? And that's when we created this not-for-profit e-liability institute. And we've been working with organizations in businesses, but also governments, hospital systems, not-for-profits, et cetera, to pilot this approach. And that's where we are now.
Yeah. Such a lot of things. So I will start with the last thing you mentioned. So try it out. I would say that's super, super important. And Sue mentioned it at the beginning. So she is responsible for the industry think tanks, which we focus on at SAP, which is a great, great thing. And I would say that's a great platform for piloting these things, to try it out. And really to say, try early, fail often, to get at the end of the day to the right or correct results, what we need. So therefore, I can only convince all of you guests who are here in the room, all procurement leaders, if you are not already participating in a think tank, this would be a great possibility that you step into a think tank and you are a front runner in this case. So super, thanks for that. And you mentioned a couple of times Bob. And Bob and SAP have a long, long, long history. So it was in the late 80s, in the early 90s, and you mentioned it already when the activity-based costing came, when balanced scorecard came, where Hasso Plattner got aware of that, and he reached out to Bob, and they embedded it in our product, and so they made use and they opened it for millions of customers that you can benefit from it as well. So maybe the next step is really to embed e-liability.
Yeah, that's certainly our hope. When we produced this algorithm for e-liability accounting, we made a very conscious decision to put it in the public domain. We could have patented it and so forth, but we didn't want to do that because we saw this as a collective public good. And the not-for-profit e-liability institute is deliberately a not-for-profit because we also want to work with governments and hospitals and others like that. But importantly, also with companies to do this. I can give you a sense of what one of these pilots look like, just so that, make it more concrete. So the first company in the world to do a pilot in this space was a tire company called GT Tire, which is based out of Indonesia. And the chairman and CEO of that company read the HBR piece and said, we're going to do this in my company, and delegated their head of quality to be the project manager. And that poor guy, his name is Francois, he calls me up and he says, what have you done to me? It's not like I have, I don't have enough to do in my life. So he said, it's okay, we'll take this one step at a time. And GT Tire, as you know, all tire companies, is a very dirty supply chain. One of the dirtiest products to make is tires, and they have hundreds of suppliers. I think something like 200 separate sort of supplier categories. And said, where can I even begin with running something like this? And what we did was, as a first pass, identify 4 suppliers that between them accounted for 85% of the tire's weight. So we said, okay, this is a rough proxy to start for, and these are fairly dirty inputs like carbon black, steel cord, synthetic rubber, natural rubber. These are all fairly dirty products. And we start with those, and we will drive for accurate direct measurement of tier 1 suppliers in this product. And that then gave them insights. As their suppliers started realizing that GT was interested in cleaner versions of their products, cleaner in the direct emission sense, then they said, well, and here are some options. We can provide this same product to you for a lower carbon footprint. In some cases, it might involve greater cost, but we want to put that in front of you. And so when GT finished its pilot, one of its largest customers is BMW. And they took the results of this pilot to BMW. And BMW said, this is great. What is this thing that you've been doing? And now, it turns out that GT's tires that are sold to BMW are not from its Indonesia plant, where they did the pilot, but from its plants in China. So part of the sort of scaling up with BMW involved scaling up this in the plants in China. And now BMW is in the process of thinking about how to roll it out across its wider supply network, but also in its own production processes, actually in the UK. So that's a way in which, effectively something like this can become very quickly contagious in supply chains. And that's really important.
Yeah. Yeah, super, and that's really great having these pilots. And you see, immediately you have followers when they see the results. And something comparable happened in the SAP case. So we have a working group, Catena X, which is focusing really on the carbon emission, especially for the automotive industry. And there we have very, very often good dialogues that we say, we find more and more great ways to measure it and to get the data, as you said, the scope 3. But what they are really missing is standards, so setting a standard. And when I got the pleasure to be in the interview with you, I went through your homepage from e-liability, and there is in the FAQ one question where someone asked you, is e-liability a new standard? And you said, no, it's not a standard, it's this algorithm. So, but what is your point of view, Karthik? Do we come closer and closer to a standard?
Yeah. That's a great question. Look, at the end of the day, this will, the kind of companies that are piloting it now, there are up to 60 companies that are in various stages of piloting, are doing it because they have a real or expected or perceived competitive advantage with decarbonization. So for instance, we're just wrapping up a pilot with Hitachi Energy here in Europe. And one of the reasons why they're keen on a pilot is because they feel like they can produce electric transformers at a lower carbon footprint than other producers of electric transformers. So for them, it's really important to demonstrate this. Likewise with companies that produce steel, cement, concrete, copper, oil and natural gas. A commodity is not a commodity. You take something like concrete. The technology for concrete for Portland cement has been around for 200 years. But if you figure out how to do this effectively at a lower emissions footprint, then that's a lot of money on the table. And that's a great way for you to sort of embrace a system like this, because it allows you to credibly demonstrate to your customers and your customers' customers that you have a lower emissions product. But you can't effectively expect to scale out this approach to the whole world if you're simply relying on that force, right? Because there are enough high emissions producers of concrete, there are enough high emissions producers of oil and natural gas, et cetera, in the world to effectively, in some sense, thwart that from becoming the equilibrium solution. So in economics, we talk about Gresham's law. Gresham's law is the idea that bad money drives out good money. And in the same sense, there's a Gresham's law which you can apply to standards, which is to say bad standards drive out good standards. If you have a standard that says you have to accurately and verifiably measure your direct emissions and then transfer them down your supply chain, that is a good and useful thing for high-performance players, but it's also costly for low performance players. So if you're a low performance player, the easiest thing to do is to make up a number, or to use your competitor's number, or to use some regional average estimate or something like that. And as long as that option is on the table, then the good standard cannot thrive. So that's where you need some sort of regulatory intervention. The good news is that both here in Europe with the people who are involved in writing CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and of course, if Europe puts together a CBAM, then the United States will as well. I've just actually flown in from Washington, D.C., where I spent the last week. There's, an effort underway in the U.S., both with the Prove It Act and also with drafting potential legislation for carbon border adjustment for something like this to be used. Because if you're going to have an input or an import adjustment, you need what's called a taxable basis, and that has to be something that's specific. But it doesn't just have to be taxation that drives this, or cross-border controls that drive this. But if you're the Securities and Exchange Commission, you would not put out a standard that said you can use industry average estimates for reporting your gross margins. So in the same way, you should be thinking about this as well. Now, I don't know where the SEC is going to go on their proposal, but we hope that between the thrust of energy with the people writing CBAM in Europe, their equivalents in the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, and also the newly created International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, there will be enough regulatory momentum to sort of put a solution like this in place.
Applaus. Thanks a lot, Karthik. Karthik, I would like to go a little step back and continue where you said, for some companies, it is really making the numbers. And some companies, to make the numbers, they buy the carbon emission certificates. And recently, you published an article to that where you as well talk about what is the risk behind? And can you share a little bit from this with us?
Sure. So, e-liabilities, which is the core of our approach to measuring embedded carbon emissions in products and services all the way up to enterprises and countries, the liability in e-liability refers to effectively the liability you create with nature when you emit a molecule or a mole of greenhouse gas like CO2 into the atmosphere. In order to be effectively net zero, in order to be in a position where you can claim that you are not incurring a liability in the production of a product or service, you will have to either entirely decarbonize your supply chain so that you're not emitting any moles of CO2 in your production process, which is very, very hard to do, given we do rely on high-emitting products for our everyday lives. Or you have to engage in what are called permanent removal offsets. Okay. Now, this is very different. A permanent removal offset is very different from the vast majority of things that currently trade in carbon offset markets. The vast majority of what trades in carbon offset markets, about 90% of what trades in carbon offset markets today, are what you might call avoidance offsets. From an accounting perspective, an avoidance offset simply results in an action to avoid emissions simply results in a lowering of your liability, your e-liability. It cannot be double counted as an asset, as an offset. So all avoidance offsets are basically future reductions in e-liabilities. They're not offsets per se. The challenge with counting an avoidance offset as an asset is there's an infinite supply of avoidance activities in the economy. And if you try to create something of which there's an infinite supply of as an asset, then that asset is meaningless, which is why so much of the carbon market, effectively, there's so much skepticism around it. Now, you think about it, the price of carbon offsets in markets trades everywhere between $2 a ton to $800 a ton. How can something trade in such a wide range, right? Part of the reason is that the vast majority of what's being traded there is actually noise. It's not an offset at all. Now, of the 10% that remains, there are removal offsets. These are things that physically remove moles of CO2 from the atmosphere and sequester them. Now, the life cycle of a mole of CO2 that you emit into the atmosphere today, say, for instance, I'm going to fly back to London later today, 3 o'clock, in fact, that will last in the atmosphere for 1,000 years, currently estimated, right? So the liability that you've incurred is a 1,000-year liability. By planting a tree, at most, you have sequestered that liability maybe 30, 40, 50 years. And then you have to sort of reinvest that, right? So it would be, so for instance, claiming that tree as an offset to the emissions that you put out in the atmosphere would be like making one monthly payment on your mortgage and saying you paid off your house. Right? It just doesn't. I mean, if the goal here is to solve climate change, that's not going to solve climate change. So not that planting trees is bad, it's that you need to have a strategy to meet your 1,000-year liability. So of that 10% that remains in the carbon offset markets, the stuff that trades as sort of nature-based offsets usually ranges in price from, say, $50 to $100 a ton, is basically a small down payment on a future liability. The stuff that's called, right now, direct air capture, DAC, et cetera, that's the stuff that you'll see is priced over $500 a ton. That's what's called a permanent removal offset. So we make the distinction between these various kinds of offsets, and we say, if you're serious about climate change, then you have to define an environmental asset or an E-asset on the basis of these rigorous criteria. And then you've got to use them to basically balance your liabilities. The beauty of this approach, this sort of bookkeeping approach to climate change, is A, it is policy neutral. You don't need to take a view on things like, you know, this technology is good or this technology is bad, et cetera. Governments are terrible at picking technologies. Instead, if they pick good rules of accounting and let the market figure out what the technology is, that's actually the way we'd want to sort of solve climate change. Unleash competitive forces to solve this problem, which is what good accounting could do. The other advantage of having this bookkeeping approach to CO2 measurement or management is that it automatically gives you a rigorous definition of net zero, right? An entity is net zero if and only if its e-liabilities at the end of every reporting period are matched by permanent removal offsets, its e-assets, right? Things that meet those. It takes away all the ambiguity out of a definition of net zero. You think about it today, and I'll say this about my own institution, Oxford, because I don't want to pick about any. Oxford has a net zero claim. What does that even mean, right? It's like imagine if a CFO said, the profits of my company in the year 2050 will be 20 kajillion chinchillas. What is a kajillion and what is a chinchilla? This is a claim that is made in unmeasurable units of unmeasurable quantity, right? Whereas if you have a carbon ledger, then you know. You know what is the path to net zero, because you can define net zero on the basis of a true and fair audit. That's how you know you're actually solving the problem. And that's what I'm hoping that our collaboration with SAP and their products, your products, will help us accomplish.
Yeah. So thanks a lot for your openness and your enthusiasm. I really like it. And Karthik, as we have here the procurement leaders, what is your advice or your view? How can procurement really bring a great effort to the decarbonization? So really here to our audience.
Yeah.
What would you wish from them?
Yeah. So look, you have the power. Julia mentioned this earlier. Vast majority of emissions that you incur are your value chain emissions, right? And you have the power to drive your suppliers and your suppliers' suppliers and their suppliers to actually engage in decarbonization. Let me close with a quick story of how this might work in place. We've just actually wrapped up a pilot with Hitachi, as I mentioned briefly. Hitachi makes many things, but amongst things they make are electrical transformers. Regardless of your source of energy, you need an electric transformer to convert it into electrical energy. Now, they were under enormous pressure from their ESG activists, et cetera, to use recycled copper in the manufacture of these transformers because recycled is considered good, as opposed to, say, virgin mine copper. But Hitachi's own production engineers were skeptical of this claim. They didn't know that this would actually make a difference. So we said, okay, this is great. This is the kind of thing you can work with the e-liability institute on, because we have no horse in this race. We can measure things really well. So we will help. So we work with Hitachi's supplier, their supplier's supplier, their supplier's supplier's supplier, all the way up to the copper mines, right? And the idea of this pilot was to understand what are the conditions or whether recycled copper is better than virgin mine copper. And the answer is it depends. Right? There are certain mines that Hitachi sources from, like the Boliden mines in Sweden, where the copper can be produced at a substantially, virgin mine copper can be produced at a substantially lower emissions profile than any recycling. In fact, in some cases, 75% less emissions than recycling, right? So now why is this important from a procurement perspective? Because Hitachi can talk to their recycled copper suppliers and say, that's the number you need to beat, right? If you can't get the number down to that, we're not buying your recycled copper. So that's the way you have enormous power in your supply chains to drive this kind of action. And that's what we would invite you to do.
Great. Thanks a lot, Karthik. This was already my last question because I get already from our master of the ceremony a sign that we have to stick to the time. James?
Thank you.
First over to
Julia, would
you.
you like to join us on stage? We're having a Q&A session. Oh, sorry, can we have some microphones? So now we have Karthik, Tamara and Julia on stage to follow up on this discussion about carbon accounting. Who has a question for the panel, based on what we've heard so far? Yes, sir. So say your name, Briyesh, where you're from.
Sorry.
Microphone, here you go.
Thank you. My name is Brijesh, and I've come from Dubai. I've really enjoyed this session right from the beginning, and thanks for this great session. Many markets, you gave a very good example, and I'm relating to the video that was played. So you talked about production and lowering the emission in the supply chain of production. But a lot of markets, they receive the products delivered. Yeah, it is made by, say, you take example of BMW, it will be made, the carbon emission count is set.
Yeah.
And then it is sent to the markets where they are sold. So when I'm buying a BMW, I'm buying a BMW with a carbon footprint already set. In such a situation, as a market that receives such products, I think sustainable disposability plays a very important role. So how does that link to your production area, and what is your advice for such markets so that, you know, it can be disposed sustainability, for example, tires?
Yeah. Okay, so that's a great question. And if you don't have the kind of, say, buyer power that, say, a Hitachi does in the supply chain to actually get your suppliers and their suppliers, et cetera, then can you create a competitive advantage around disposal? Actually, that comes up, that example beautifully comes up in one of the tiers of the supply chain in the Hitachi pilot I just mentioned. I said we had to go various tiers in. And for many of those intermediate, you know, if you're Boliden, the mining company that's making the copper, and your Hitachi, you sort of, you know, your big companies that many of the intermediate companies are very small. They're basically price takers, but also carbon takers. And then, right, so where does the competitive advantage come from? So for one of the companies that's in the business of taking the copper cathodes and turning, which are these flat metal plates, and turning them into copper rods, right? It's a very commodity type thing to do. Their competitive advantage comes exactly from that. They said, well, we can figure out a way to, the waste that's produced in this, to dispose that in a clean way, so Hitachi buy from us. Because otherwise, right? So that's another way in which, yes, absolutely, identify where you have the margins, both from an emission sense and from a capital sense, and a cost sense, and use those to drive the decision making.
Okay, thanks, Karthik. Other questions for the panel?
We can cold call.
No. So I have a question. I have a question for you, Karthik, on this e-liability. So do you imagine that companies, as well as submitting a financial invoice to their customers, will also submit like a carbon invoice to say, here's the carbon that I've consumed, and you need to put this on your books as part of your green ledger? Is that sort of the parallel between a financial invoice and a carbon invoice? Is that what you're envisaging here?
Yes, that's sort of what we've envisaged conceptually. But you guys are actually in the business of building products that do that. So I'll turn it over to you. Yeah.
Yeah, very much. I mean, again, in the early pilot work, we're very much looking at whether it be a procurement decision or a CFO financial reporting decision of saying, I'm looking, today we look at top line, bottom line, right? And then you make decisions around that. So to bring up in a third and parallel and same level of precision, top line, bottom line, and carbon line. And then you can make a more holistic decision, but having that same unequal path. And literally, you know, the early concept and dashboards we have today are very much, you know, those three measures. And of course, the carbon piece, we need to get better and better and bring in the scope 3 so you have the full life cycle and that you're using actuals, not averages. So there's a journey there. But effectively, in the experience itself, having the same level of precision and clarity to say, I'm going to make a balanced decision of whether I'm purchasing something or whether how I'm reporting it, to have those three things as equals.
Question here. Thanks, Arto. Yep. Microphone coming. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Sanjay Pandya from ArcelorMittal. I think we are going for a very big decarbonization journey. As you know, steel industry is going towards that. I understand that carbon accounting is a future-proofing your business because it's a license to operate. But what we see that we don't find the traction in the market. And again, it's a geographical issue. Maybe Europe is leading the way, but when you have steel coming from China or from other places, you don't find the same thing customers are looking at that. So how do you see this? The technologies should evolve, or carbon accounting should be the future. How do you see that? Or there has to be some political consensus that should emerge.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are actually, we would welcome the opportunity to do a pilot with ArcelorMittal. We've finished 2 pilots with Tata Steel, one in their Netherlands plant and one in their plant in Miramandali in India. And in some sense, the pilots yielded very different insights, in part because of the kinds of issues you're talking about. There's much greater interest and uptake for low-emission steel in a place like Europe than there would be, say, in India or in China, for that matter, elsewhere. Well, one way in which you can certainly, increase the supply of green steel or green cement or whatever it is something like a carbon border adjustment, right? So if both Europe and the US move in that direction, then that creates an enormous incentive for manufacturers in other parts of the world to comply, because otherwise they just won't be competitive. But within Europe itself, there's, of course, a variance of customers. And I mean, one of the interesting things that came out of the Tata Europe pilot is the following. So in Europe, there is enormous pressure for steel companies to abandon the BOF technology, the basic oxygen furnace technology, and go to the EAC, the electric arc furnace technology. One of the challenges with that approach, which the policymakers haven't apparently considered, is that a byproduct in BOF is slag. And slag is used actually as a low emissions filler in the manufacture of concrete, right? So if you take away all the BOFs in Europe, then the supply of slag goes away and the concrete becomes dirtier, right? And it turns out that actually that results in more emissions than the emissions that you would save from moving BOFs to EAC, electric arc furnaces, and in part because of the enormous capital emissions required to transfer from one technology back. So one of the advantages of having a full accounting of this sort across sectors, across industries, is that, again, we're not making bets on technologies, we're making bets on, saying, reducing moles of CO2 into the atmosphere. And that's the sense in which actually the more steel companies we have in these pilots, the better. So it's not just because one company in the steel industry has done it, we're saying, no, actually we need to build a competitive sort of a collaboration of, say, because then we know that that will drive what's best practice. And as you can imagine, then there's a conversation the steel industry needs to have with the cement industry here in Europe, right? That's part of the conversation we'd want to stimulate from this.
So make sure you speak to Karthik before he goes to the airport, because it sounds like ArcelorMittal has a lot to talk about there. So that'd be great. Okay. Other questions for the team?
We got a hand up here.
Oh, go ahead.
Vincent from actually Switzerland. So quite lucky, I would say, on the workplace here. One of the, money to some extent is a kind of a closed currency. So you can count it at the end of the day. You can always go to your bank and see what's remaining. Carbon, whatever we do, doesn't have that closeness. At the end of the day, measuring carbon remains, even from a scientific point of view, always an estimate. And as a buyer, you're going to have someone in India, someone in Indonesia, in China, to take your examples. How do you see the level of harmonization across countries to end up with a number that not equal, but at least on the same level of standards?
That's an excellent question, and something that we've been spending a fair bit of time on right now. Short answer is we're actually doing some work with the Bundesbank on this right now because they're also thinking very seriously about, central banks issue currency, and that basically what gives you the basis for a monetary economy. What is the role of central banks, or what institution will underlie the creation of effectively a fungible unit of carbon is part of the question that you're asking. It involves two layers of conceptual analysis, and let me quickly walk you through both. The first is on the measurement side. So we look, all that matters from the purposes of carbon accounting is measurement of direct emissions, what you might know as Scope 1 emissions. Because the only moles of CO2 that actually enter the atmosphere is Scope 1 emissions, right? Scope 2, Scope 3 are just simply a recounting of those Scope 1 emissions. So Scope 1 is where the action is, and that's what we need to, or direct emissions is what we call them, is where we need to focus. There are three ways in which you do this right now. The vast majority of current direct emissions are measured using what are called estimations. Estimations are basically, some vague models. They're not very good. The best way to do this is direct measurement by using, say, for instance, metrics at smokestacks or something like that, where you're actually counting moles of CO2 go into the atmosphere. That happens very rarely, and about 5% of all direct emissions are measured that way. In an intermediate step between that kind of direct measurement and estimation is what's called calculation. Calculation is a little more robust in the sense that, let's say you're making cement. Then in your making cement, you have to take limestone and convert it into clinker. Limestone, the chemical formula is CaCO3. Clinker, the chemical formula is CaO. You do the math. CO2 is what goes out. So if you can measure the input of CaCO3 and the output of CaO, you can impute through calculation what is there, right? So that's the intermediate. All three of these are being used. We would like to see much less of the estimation and much more of the direct emission measurement and the calculation. So that's part of the effort too. Now, one way in which this will be made more robust is through the carbon accounting system. So SAP has a version of this system, but as you can imagine, there are competitors producing systems as well. And what's interesting is that there are different technological approaches being taken to this. Some of the approaches are closed systems in the sense of when you've got a unit of, say, CO2 emissions captured in without naming companies. Let's say there are 3 ERP companies that are making this, and ERP company 1 says, we're going to have a closed system. That means that when they record an emission as 1 unit of, say, CO2, then they're guaranteeing, like a central bank guarantees, they're guaranteeing that that closed unit of emission is fungible across its thousands, hundreds of thousands of uses in the economy. Right? So in some sense, that ERP system is, together with the assurance at the direct emission stage, providing the role of a central bank. There are open versions of this system as well, ERP systems. Let's say ERP company 3 has an open system which says, all we are doing is providing an open sort of in the sense of a blockchain, but it's an open blockchain where anyone can look into it. So we're not going to assure the underlying number. It's up to you to go open that blockchain and figure out whether that's a number you can trust and add to your... As you can imagine, that adds tremendous costs to the process. It also adds some variance, etc. So there's that. In between, there's an intermediate solution, which is neither fully open nor sort of fully closed, where you have a private key. So certain players, like, say, your auditors and your customers, and they will have access to that private key, but it's not open per se. So all three of these approaches are developing across different ERP systems right now. As the e-liability institute and as academics, we're agnostic to it. In some sense, we want the market of ERP suppliers to sort of figure this out and determine what is, what do customers want? Right? So, but it's a great question, and the short answer is watch this space, because in the next 3 to 5 years, this will evolve very, very rapidly.
Okay. Julia, how is SAP looking at these different ways of doing things?
I was about to say that. I like Mike Collin Occam, actually. My subject matter expert in the back of, I think right now we're still working through and taking a open, I think we're in early piloting of them, but I didn't know, Occam, if you had a specific of we were leaning one way or another in terms of that, or we're still kind of an open pilot.
Yeah, so the main...
Just introduce yourself.
Does it work?
Introduce yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Achim Achim Wormanek works in German, works in English. I'm part of the spend management organization that drives the marketing and solution management forward. So I report to Etosha, and part of the team that put up this event is, I'm lucky to work with them very, very closely. So thanks for coming, and also from my side. Yeah, so one of the things that we do at SAP is actually we work with Karthik. Yeah, so you have a very good inroads into our product team that looks into the green ledger, and so we're basically a little mimicking what we did with balanced scorecard there a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think that's how we're gonna drive that forward. But also, like Tamara said, we need more of these pilots. Yeah, we need more experimentation around that. To your point, to define exactly what's going to be this, how is this going to settle in the next 3 to 5 years.
That's right.
But yeah, Karthik, you have been a great ally in defining that with us, and so that's what we're going to push forward. Even also with the business network. Yeah, so we fundamentally believe that the business network that connects companies with each other will need to be a place where these things get exchanged, and if you decide so, an open system is then part of that. So I think that's kind of where we're heading.
That's right. I mean, they have a great technical team that is producing it. We have the pleasure of working with them. And the short answer is, I think they're at a stage where obviously, technologically, they can produce all three of these solutions. That's not the, they would, I mean, actually, this is one of the advantages of working in on the early pilots, is you get to shape, to my point of the path dependency, you get to shape the outcome. So one of the ways, and there are some pilots that we're working on with SAP and the e-liability institute, so the three-way pilots, you get to shape what that looks like. So if you're an early pilot, you say, okay, what is the level of data assurance that I would want to be able to trust information that comes 7 layers up a supply chain, right? And how do I do that in a way that's cost effective? These are precisely the questions that the technical team is working on right now. And you know, you guys should connect, obviously.
Okay. Any more questions we have? So, Julie, when you go out visiting SAP customers, how do they talk about these issues? What are you hearing from the executives that you speak to regarding sustainability and how to deal with these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and we're certainly picking up on the themes that Karthik mentioned. There's a lot of questions around the regulations, the harmonization, the different standards. I have a lot of interest in the topic, but I think one of the top topics is like, well, where do I focus and which one do I pick and how do I go about it, right? And I think I love your perspective on the harmonization. That's one of my questions for you. I hear that a lot of there's these different bodies, there's different organizations, and you know, it's almost like the very early days of data privacy. And we were kind of looking, will it be like a GDPR journey or was something else? But I think that to me is there's competing approaches, whether it be the, you know, from how we're measuring it, but also from the different international bodies as well. And I think a lot of business leaders I work with are kind of feeling a little bit trapped on how to navigate that complexity and looking for us, you know, similar different times organizations working together to get some of that harmonization. So, but I have to say too, I think there's been a theme, particularly maybe in the US, that sustainability no longer is that important and it's falling in priority. And I have to say, my lived experience working with execs across the world hasn't proven to be true. I haven't seen it drop from one of the top 3 priorities, from chairmen to CEOs to procurement leaders. So it's interesting. There's a theme out there, but I haven't seen that reality. But interested in the perspective from the room, and I don't know. Curious of your perspective as well.
I'm happy to share some thoughts on this. So. As I mentioned, I've just come back from Washington, and so I'd say there is certain ESG has become a more politically loaded term in the U.S. Than it was even, say, 6 months ago, and that is likely to continue into the presidential election cycle. But that said, there were several Republicans represented in the conversations we were having on carbon accounting for 2 reasons. One, I think I would separate out carbon from the rest of ESG. That has its own. And amongst Republican circles, where that polls really well is pollution management as a term, pollution management, rather than, say, ESG or sustainability or something like that. So there's that. And 2, that a lot of Republican interest in this is driven by a carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? So it's seen as a way in a world where, you know, we may not be living in a flat world of globalization, but we may be living in a world with some walls, then this becomes a basis for that. So I don't quite think the carbon issue is quite going away, although ESG more broadly is under some political attack. There's I think, you know, look, I'm often asked the question, 2 questions. One, this seems like such an obvious solution. Why would it not succeed? And the second question is sort of, how to get there. But on the first question, why would it not succeed? I think the only reason why it wouldn't is if we're not serious about climate change, right? I mean, and that's a possibility. It's because we collectively need to decide as a society that this is something we want to put our resources towards. This is not free, right? I mean, in the sense of reimagining your processes to build new competitive advantages, all obviously involves adjustment costs. There might be more value at the end of the table as a result, but that's why I said something about short-term sacrifices for long-term value. But if we're not serious about climate change as a global priority, then why would you want an expensive system like this? You can just make up any numbers and pretend you're solving the problem. So that's one reason why this might not work. But if we're thinking about the path of how we get there in that sense, then there was a remarkable period in, say, U.S. history after the Securities Acts were passed in 1933 and 1934. Up until that time, there was no such thing as, say, generally accepted accounting principles. I mean, that was part of the problem in the 1920s, that everybody just kind of made up their definition of an asset. And you can imagine there were clearly some good companies, but there were some terrible companies that had made up all kinds of nonsense assets. So there was a 6-year window from 1934 to about 1940 when the SEC went about effectively codifying what were best practices into what we today recognize as GAAP. There is this equivalent opportunity to do that, whether it's the ISSB that does that, because this would be a global challenge, right? Or somebody has to do that. Maybe it's a consortium of companies like yourself that does that. But there is, in the next 3 to 6 years, a remarkable opportunity to get this really right. In the same way that 90 years ago, we got this right with financial accounting. That's sort of what I would see as a path forward. But it requires lead steer companies, right? All the companies here in this room, but also intermediaries like SAP that are producing the technology to sort of make this happen at scale. It requires everyone to sort of say, okay, this is an investment that I'm willing to make because I see the light at the other side.
Okay, thanks very much, Karthik, Julia and Tamara. Please round of applause. Thank you so much.